Okay.
Can you change the audience and date at the bottom of the first page, please?
Um, it should say Environmental Defense Fund, May 22nd, 2024.
Oh, huh, that's weird. I bet we're having yet another one of our Dropbox
Yeah,
sync problems.
excellent.
Okay, that's fine, whatever. Okay,
Sorry. Uh,
no issues.
your inbox and my Dropbox technology.
Um, okay, why don't we get started?
Great. All right. Well, I'm assuming that some more folks will trickle in as we get going, but good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be, and thank you all of you for joining our May EDF Economics Seminar. We are thrilled to have Professor Matt Zaragoza Watkins join us from the UC Davis Graduate School of Management. Matt studies the design and performance of energy and environmental markets and has advised policymakers, regulators, and NGOs, including Environmental Defense Fund, on implementation and design on regional emissions markets and greenhouse gas emissions policy. Matt holds a PhD from Berkeley and a Bachelor of Science from Cornell, and previously served on faculty at Vanderbilt University. Matt, we are thrilled again to have you here today, along with your co-author, Professor James Stock from Harvard University. Professor Zaragoza Watkins is going to be presenting on recent research that he and Professor Stock conducted to understand the implications on LNG exports for US gas prices and greenhouse gas emissions, a topic of great interest to all of us here at EDF. One quick housekeeping note before we get started. These seminars are recorded. You can find the recordings on our YouTube channel or on our seminar webpage. I'll drop that in the chat. Matt's going to be presenting for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A about 20 minutes at the end. If you have something that you'd like to discuss as Matt is presenting, please just drop it in the chat, and I'll keep an eye out for any questions to raise. With that, why don't you go ahead and get started, Matt?
Terrific. Thank you so much for having me here. It's really a privilege to be able to present to this audience. And let me acknowledge also my co-author, Jim. He's like the Paul McCartney of time series econometrics. Today you're getting Ringo. So if I have any run into any stumpers, I'll pass it off to Jim. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and then let's see, put it into presentation mode. There we go. Okie doke. Okay, so today I'm presenting the market and climate implications of US LNG exports. This is work with Jim and myself, and with tremendous assistance from Constanza Abuin and George Bradley. So over the last decade, there have been a lot of changes in natural gas, and in particular, the United States has become the world's largest LNG exporter. So we have two figures that sort of describe or demonstrate the nature of these transitions. On the left, we have exports of LNG. These are annual exports from some of the major LNG exporters in the world. And we can see that the United States, was exporting no LNG in 2015. And after the opening of the Cheniere exporting terminal, that's steadily ramped up as new terminals have opened and begin exporting. And now in 2023, the US is the #1 exporter of LNG in the world, and that trend is expected to persist. And then over on the right here, we've got the share of natural gas imports and exports in terms of consumption and production. And there we can see really that there's been a significant ramp up in the share of natural gas produced that's being exported, again, following that transition towards the opening of LNG facilities. Now, a little bit of background in terms of process. So an LNG facility, before shovels hit the ground, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has the authority over siting and construction and operation of LNG import and export facilities, right? So FERC is going to lead the review to determine whether this facility can be sited and started. But then under Section 3 of the Natural Gas Act, DOE has authority over gas export permits. Now, if it's a free trade agreement country, that export permit is going to happen automatically. But in instances where the exports are not going to go to a free trade country, DOE has to grant an export license unless it finds that exports are not consistent with the public interest in the United States. Now, the initial test of this was Cheniere's Sabine Pass Train 1, which applied for an export license in September 2010. That export permit was approved in August 2012, and essentially the facility was completed and began operating in May of 2016. That's going to turn out to be an important date because it's really the start of a new era in the relationship between natural gas prices in the United States, oil prices around the world, and natural gas prices elsewhere. Now, recently, the Biden-Harris administration announced a temporary pause on pending decisions about export permits for liquefied natural gas, these non-free trade agreement countries. In particular, there's concern that given the expansion of LNG facilities, it may no longer be, or assessment of the impacts of LNG exporting on domestic natural gas prices may no longer be adequate. Additionally, given advances in our estimates of the impacts of CO2 emissions and methane emissions on the environment, it's possible that those sort of global public health concerns aren't adequately considered. And additionally, anytime a new export facility is built, right, that construction and ongoing operation is going to potentially have an impact on sort of the health and environmental status of neighboring communities. And so the Biden-Harris administration is concerned with that as well. We think these are important considerations. And so from our standpoint, right, the analytical issues at play here are in terms of domestic energy and CO2 emissions, what are the impacts of exporting? That's going to be the main topic and focus of our paper. Of course, it's also important in thinking about this to understand what the international energy price and CO2 emissions implications are, the long-term effects potentially of investing in this capital, which is a long-lived asset, the domestic distributional consequences, right? So when energy prices rise domestically, that has an impact on welfare of consumers, both of natural gas and other downstream services and products. And then understanding the life cycle emissions, excluding direct combustion, of course, because that's already covered. And as we talked about, the local environmental impacts. But again, our paper is really focusing on the domestic energy price impacts and to a narrow extent, the impact on greenhouse gas emissions, particularly CO2 emissions, in the electricity generation sector, which we think is a major sort of source of changes. So an overview of this paper, we're going to ask and try to answer 3 questions. What's been the effect of LNG exports on US gas prices? What are the implications for US gas and coal prices going forward, right? To the extent that gas and coal are substitutes in the electricity generation space, how might coal prices be affected? And then what are the implications for the US energy transition and CO2 emissions of this change or these changes in gas and coal prices as a result of changes in LNG exporting behavior? So having covered the outline, in the next section, I'm going to talk about domestic price effects. And it's going to be focused on a lot of statistical analyses, which much of which I'm going to try and show graphically. We're going to look at gas prices, differences in price regimes, essentially the relationship between gas prices and other energy commodities. We're going to estimate the cost of liquefaction, transportation, and regasification, which has important implications for the trade of LNG and the impact of changes in LNG prices sort of domestically on prices in other foreign markets. We're going to take a look at what the impacts have been for coal, and then we're going to estimate a couple of LNG price effects. Presuming we have time, we're going to talk about the implications for the US energy transition using NREL's Reed's model to simulate what the impacts of differences in coal and gas prices would be on the electricity generation sector out to 2030. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what this has been doing to the long-term contracting market, some thoughts on life cycle emissions and international effects. So this in one figure really is the essence of our paper, I think. So let me spend some time on this and break it down a little bit. On the vertical axis here, we've got dollars per MMBTU, right? So that's the price of energy. And then on the horizontal axis, we've got time. And we've got these 3 time series. The red is Henry Hub natural gas 3-month out futures. The solid light blue line is the WTI 3-month futures at what we're calling energy parity, right? So natural gas has different underlying energy content per than oil. And so what we're doing is taking into account the amount of energy that you get from combusting natural gas versus oil and parameterizing that and calling it parity. The black line is Central Appalachian bituminous coal 3-month futures, again at an energy parity. So considering when combusting coal in a steam turbine, the quantity of energy that you get from that versus oil versus gas, right? And then finally, we have this dashed light blue line, which is the WTI 3-month futures at natural gas combined cycle parity. So traditionally, we've used steam boilers to produce electricity. More recently, innovations in natural gas combined cycle technology have changed the efficiency with which we can convert natural gas into usable energy. And so what this takes into account is that. And then it's minus $4. Why $4? Well, because we have an independent set of analysts' estimates of the cost of liquefaction, right? That's turning gas or natural gas from a gaseous to a liquid state, transporting that liquefied natural gas, and then regasifying it, essentially re-expanding it. And the sort of industry estimates of that cost are about $4. So what this says here is looking at the way these lines sort of follow each other or track each other, we identify kind of 4 specific regimes. Our regime 1A is burner tip parity. And that's in reference to the idea that when energy, oil, and natural gas are being priced out, what a trader or purchaser might be thinking of is, look, I can either use oil or gas, and the efficiency with which I can convert each to electricity using a steam boiler is really going to determine my willingness to pay for each of those. And so that relationship sort of engineering relationship should then determine the prices of each. And between 97 and 2006, we really see that relationship bear out. Period 1B is what we call a transition period. And that's, with the rise of fracking in North America, you see significant increases in the supply and supply elasticity of natural gas. What that means is that the domestic or North American supply of natural gas is rising significantly. And to the extent that that's putting downward pressure on natural gas, if there isn't enough demand to soak up all of that additional production, then that's going to drive down the price of gas relative to oil because oil is no longer an attractive substitute. Period 2 is what we call shut-in, right? So that's really as fracking is fully ramped up, gas prices in North America are persistently low and no longer tied to oil prices because oil is less and less a substitute in electricity generation. It's just not cost competitive. But then we have this final period, or the current period that we're in, LNG exporting. So as the opportunity to sell LNG outside of North America, being produced in North America, arises, suddenly there's a new source of demand for that fuel. And so that new source of demand is going to be the marginal source of demand. And so it's going to dictate to some degree, or at least that's our maintained hypothesis, the relationship between oil and LNG prices, because purchasers in Europe and Japan and around the world are now making a decision about whether they want to purchase oil for use as an electricity input or whether they want to purchase LNG. And so what we see is during that period 3 regime, the dashed line, WTI 3-month futures, and the red line, Henry Hub natural gas 3-month futures, are really tracking each other very closely, reflecting the fact that the marginal consumer is now making a choice about what source of energy they want to use. Why WTI? Well, mainly it's international indexation. So like I said, this, there we go. International gas prices are indexed to Brent, European crude oil. And so what we have here, again, is 2 axes. The vertical axis on the left is dollars per MMBTU. That's going to be for natural gas, right? And on the right, we've got Brent Europe, dollars per barrel. These are outlier adjusted. And so these are the time series of 3 things. We've got the EU composite natural gas price, dollars per MMBTU. We've got the gas price, TTF, which is essentially Netherlands or sort of Central European nodal pricing. And then we've got Brent crude. And we can see that these 3 lines track each other very closely throughout this entire era. Again, emphasizing this idea both of energy parity, so making decisions on the basis of the energy content that you're purchasing for use in electricity generation, but then also because that energy parity relationship exists, often long-term natural gas contracts were tied to oil contracts to make sure that any buyer and seller weren't exposed to significant losses, right, as a result of swings in one price relative to each other. But that has the effect of binding those 2 price series together. The same is true in Asia, right? Where here now we're looking at natural gas prices in the EU, LNG prices in Japan in the black line, and the Brent spot price at NGCC parity, right? So that's assuming that the substitution is oil versus natural gas in a combined cycle plant. Again, the relationships follow each other very closely. So a second point to emphasize here, WTI minus Henry Hub parity. We see during our sort of fourth regime, LNG exporting, the governing coefficient in terms of thinking about the substitution between natural gas and oil changes from energy parity. So when I say energy parity, I'm talking about use of natural gas or oil in a steam boiler, to NGCC parity, right? We're thinking of the substitution being between oil in a steam boiler and natural gas in a combined cycle power plant, right? So different technologies lead to changes in the coefficient on substitution patterns between these two energy sources. Giving you a peek of the forecast. So what we're going to do is take the estimated relationships that we see during the period of LNG exporting and consider, well, what then might happen in a world where those relationships persist, right, versus a world in which we don't have co-integration. We don't have fundamental linkage between the series of prices of LNG and oil and coal. And so those differences then are going to be the way that we estimate the treatment effect of exporting. We're going to assume that in a world without exporting, we don't have those linkages, we don't have that co-integration. And so those two time series are free to move off in separate directions. More to come on that. So finally, for this slide, we're going to get two estimates then of the impact of LNG recoupling. One is going to be a prospective estimate, right, where we use that forecasting model to sort of move forward in time and think about what the differences in prices would be in a world in which there is recoupling and a world in which there isn't. And then we're also going to have this retrospective analysis where we say, well, what if during that period of shut-in where there was significant growth in fracking, but not any growth in LNG exporting, we actually had LNG exporting capacity that led to the same relationship between oil and natural gas prices that we see in the LNG export regime previously. And in that case, we estimate that the difference in gas prices would have been about $2.30. All right. Finally, we're going to take these differences, particularly using the prospective forecast, and think about how differences in natural gas and coal prices, the two sort of main fossil-fired sources of energy that are used in the US electric generation sector, how changes in those price series feed through to changes in investment, generation, and emissions in the sector, the electricity generation sector, through 2030. And so there, the impact on emissions of LNG exporting, right, of changes in these underlying price series is really going to hinge on whether the main substitution effects are gas versus coal, right, or fossil versus non-fossil. And what we're going to see is possibly some complementarity between the falling non-fossil prices for variable renewables and the rising gas and coal prices. It's going to look like the main substitution pattern or the dominant substitution pattern is going to be between fossil and non-fossil. All right. Keep moving this box around. Okie dokie. So I showed you that we have these four institutional regimes. Where do they come from? Right? What are the underlying sources of this? And so here now, our first institutional regime is one where we have steam boilers. And so this upper left figure is talking about sort of the period in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Generation from steam boilers is declining as fracking rises, and the shift is to NGCC. And essentially now we're living in a world in which in North America or the United States, there's very little oil generated electricity. In the upper right, the part of the story is we see this rapid rise in fracked gas. And so here we have the Pennsylvania natural gas gross withdrawals, Pennsylvania being kind of the marker for fracked gas, right? And we see that starting in 2010, that really ramps up. That coincides very closely with our second institutional breakpoint. And then our third institutional breakpoint is the start of Cheniere, right? When exporting starts, that's going to have an impact, we think, on the dynamics of negotiation and long-term contracting. And that's going to start showing up in the relationship between oil and gas prices because long-term LNG contractors are thinking about where they're going to be pulling gas from and the price of oil. And now North America is a new source of supply. So how are we going to estimate these relationships? We're going to start with unit root tests. Essentially, that's asking whether there's a stochastic trend in each of these underlying time series, right? And that's going to be important because if there is no underlying stochastic trend, then it's not going to be surprising to discover that these time series are co-integrated, right? If they're not trending in any direction, then of course they're going to have a relationship which is stable over time. And that's not going to tell us anything about dynamics. It's just going to be a point of fact, right? So what we're going to find, to give you a sort of preview here, is that each of these underlying time series are going to have unit roots or stochastic trends, right? So they're all moving in particular directions, somewhat away from zero. Now there we have an opportunity to test for co-integration, right? So they're moving away from zero. Do they appear to be moving away from zero together, right? Or separately? If they're moving away from zero and moving together, right, then that gives us sort of stronger suggestive evidence that what's going on is that they have a dynamic relationship that feeds in on each other. We're going to find that's the case to varying degrees over these different regimes, right? During periods when there is LNG trade, and when in North America, substitution is happening between oil and natural gas within the electric sector, those relationships are going to exist and be relatively strong and rational. Here, by rational, I mean either governed by energy parity or NGCC parity. And we're going to find that we don't have evidence or weaker evidence of similar relationships during these transition and lock-in periods, right? Consistent with an inability to trade LNG on the margin. We're going to do a break date estimation to try and empirically identify the sort of institutional breaks that we've discovered. And we're going to find essentially consistent times. They're not going to be exactly online, but very close. And then we're going to do a rolling co-integration estimate to try and estimate what the cost is of liquefaction, transportation, and regasification, right? So we have this independent analyst's estimate of what that's going to be. We're also going to run a series of dynamic OLS estimations and recover essentially a very similar parameter from that exercise. Okay, lots of numbers. So I think that the key things to focus on here are the things that are circled in red, blue, and green, right? And so these are our estimates of the break dates, right? So break dates here are defined as dates when the relationship, the co-integrating relationship between oil and gas shift. And so starting from, let's see, we'll start from column row. This first row here. When we use our institutional break dates, what we find are the co-integrating relationships between oil and gas during the sort of initial period closely mirror energy parity. During the transition period, relationship is gonna weaken. And then during the LNG exporting period, then lock-in, it's essentially going to be zero. During the LNG exporting period, the co-integrating relationship is going to shift towards something that's consistent with NGCC parity. Now, that's true if we use our institutional break dates. And as I was saying before, we're going to find similar patterns if we use our estimated break dates, right? So there, we're going to let the data sort of speak about what the co-integrating relationships are over different ranges, asserting that there are 4 separate sort of epochs or time periods. And there, again, we're going to get estimates that are largely consistent with energy parity initially, sort of no co-integrating relationship during the transition and lock-in period, and then a co-integrating relationship that's consistent with NGCC parity during the LNG exporting period. Visually, what can we do with this? We can think about actual Henry Hub price versus the Henry Hub price that's predicted using our estimated coefficients and the underlying oil price. Right? And there we see very good agreement between the two lines over these distinct eras where we have different sort of estimated relationships. Right? The same is true, sorry, if we use institutional, or here we use the estimated break dates and coefficients. Again, very close agreement. Essentially, this is a show of model fit. Here now we're transitioning to this rolling dynamic OLS estimation, where what we're looking at is the difference in the price of gas and the energy equivalent price of oil over different time periods, where each sort of point is estimated using 6 years of data, and then that window rolls forward. And so we get a new point estimate for each kind of week. And what we see then is that the constant difference between Henry Hub and the WTI equivalent is shifting over this period, and then settles to a difference of about $4, right, during our energy exporting regime, or our LNG exporting regime. Now that $4 difference, which we can see mapped out in blue when the parity relationship that we impose is NGCC parity, and red when the parity relationship that we impose is energy parity, or steam boiler parity. What we get during the era of the sort of fourth regime is a $4 difference, which is essentially exactly in line with our estimate from the independent set of analysts. We also run these tests looking at the prices of natural gas in Europe and the UK against Brent, kind of the local oil reference. And there we see relationships using a shorter time series, which ends prior to kind of the start of the Ukraine war, that are consistent with NGCC parity. Why is this important? Well, we can see that oil is the swing product, right, that can be traded and is flowing either to Europe or to Asia or to North America. And the terms of trade, in terms of pricing of these commodities, natural gas versus oil in the US and natural gas versus oil in the UK and Europe, are following similar sort of energy parity relationships, which is suggestive that people would be making trade-offs here between these two, both in the selling market and in the ostensible receiving market. The next thing we're going to do is look at the relationship between natural gas and coal. So here, gas and coal are obviously substitutes in electricity production in the United States and abroad. We're going to focus on Henry Hub prices and Central Appalachian coal prices, where coal-fired generators and gas-fired NGC generators are competing to supply the grid. We have institutional break dates and single estimated break date. And what we find are co-integrating coefficients that are consistent with NGCC parity during our sort of LNG trading regime, right? So again, now kind of filling in the picture, we've got NGCC generators and steam-fired generators abroad competing in foreign markets to generate electricity, which is driving a relationship between oil and gas prices, both abroad and also in sort of the exporting margin in North America. And then back home domestically, where gas-fired and coal-fired generators are competing, we see that the price of coal and the price of gas has a co-integrating relationship that's consistent with that same sort of NGCC parity versus steam power generation within the electric sector. Visually, what does that look like? It looks like during sort of exporting period here, the price of Central Appalachian coal futures and the Central Appalachian coal futures prices predicted using Henry Hub during our LNG exporting period track each other very closely. So there's good model fit in terms of that relationship. So what can we do with all this, right? We built up all this machinery. We understand that there are these relationships that exist between gas, oil, and now coal prices domestically. And so what we can do then is think about alternative scenarios. And the first one is imagine a world in which actually those co-integrating relationships don't actually exist, right? Each of these fuel energy sort of time series is its own random walk. And so from that, we can estimate a vector autoregression in first differences for each of these commodities and forecast out what the price would be. We think of that conceptually as what you had during a period of lock-in, right? Where the co-integrating relationship between oil and gas was zero or sort of non-existent. And so if we had continued to have that lock-in, there was no LNG exporting, presumably that relationship would have persisted. Right? And so it's a no exporting counterfactual. Then additionally, we can think about a circumstance in which the gas-coal co-integrating relationship exists, right? But that's the only one. So there's domestic competition between gas and coal, but there's still sort of lock-in. Third, we can consider what if there was a relationship between gas and coal, but additionally, we also impose the relationship between gas and oil that we found empirically during our LNG exporting period, imposing NGCC parity on both the relationship between gas and coal and gas and oil. That's going to be our third red forecast. And then finally, we can think about a system where we estimate all of these relationships using dynamic OLS jointly, and then impose those additional constraints. And so what do we get when we get this is we get these four lines. And the differences, right, in these paths essentially reflects the differences in prices between what we expect and what we might have expected in a world in which these co-integrating relationships didn't exist. And so in a world in which we have persistent co-integration, that's our sort of light blue and red lines, prices of gas and coal are consistently, persistently higher going out into the future, domestically at least. So that's our prospective forecast of the price impacts. And there, now we can also think about retrospectively what might the world have looked like if we hadn't had this period of shut-in. And so there, what we do is we estimate the mean counterfactual price um, minus the observed price over episode 2. So the mean counterfactual price is just our NGCC parity coefficient on WTI, minus $4, inflation adjusted. That's for the liquefaction, transportation, and regasification costs that we estimate, minus our mean price observed during episode 2 of Henry Hub. So the difference that we get then is about $2.30 per MMBTU. That is, the natural gas price, or the Henry Hub price, would have been $2.30 higher during this period, a sort of historically low period, if there had been a pressure release valve in the form of LNG exporting, which we now have, right, apparently. Okay, quickly, because I know we're running a little short on time, let me talk about the implications for the US energy transition and CO2 emissions. And there we're going to use the REED simulation model. So REEDS is this investment and dispatch model produced by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory that considers the sort of short, medium, and long run costs of investing in new sources of generation, and also then runs a dispatch module and sort of iterates over those two things to make sure that the investments that are made are cost effective and that the dispatch is cost minimizing. Why do we do this? Well, because we think that the US electricity sector is the one that's sort of most profoundly affected by changes in natural gas and coal prices domestically. And the forecasting element, because we understand that this is happening against a backdrop of changing technology costs. And so the substitution patterns that could dominate over the sort of medium and long run are really going to be governed by the relationship or the cross-price elasticities of fossil fuels and alternative intermittent sources of renewable generation. High-level important caveat. So these are CO2 emissions from the power sector only, right? So this is not a global analysis of changes in CO2 emissions. We just think it's a first order important change in CO2 emissions, and so it's one we're focusing on. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the notes, but they're available here for you to peruse at your convenience later. So what do we find? We run 6 different simulation runs, one in which we sort of include recoupling at NGC parity, a second in which we have recoupling, and we estimate, we use the estimated relationship between Henry Hub and WTI. And so what we have here then are levels of annual CO2 emissions, generation by resource type, and generation capacity by resource type. Our third column covers a no recoupling scenario, right? So no co-integration. Our fourth is the vector autoregression, so no co-integration at all, either between Henry Hub and WTI or between Henry Hub and coal. The fifth is just the AEO reference case scenario. So this is the baseline scenario that's used in the REEDS NREL analysis to give you a sense of where AEO was at circa 23. And then finally, we have a sixth column, which is column 4. So that's again our sort of no co-integration scenario, but imposing a $30 carbon tax on coal and natural gas. And qualitatively, what we see is that the differences between columns 2 and 3, essentially a world in which we have recoupling and co-integration between WTI and Henry Hub, and a world in which we don't, is about 140 million metric ton difference in CO2 emissions from the electricity generation industry, which is comparable in a sense, to the imposition of a $30 carbon tax, right? Where the emissions would be somewhat lower, but on the order of this co-integration effect. Now, another important caveat is that the Reed's model is a moving target, and they're constantly updating it. So we are following their process and are planning to update our results, kind of using the newest iterations of that model as well. That could have important implications for our estimates, but this is our sort of snapshot. Okie dokie. So maybe just a quick word on remarks, and then I want to open it up and save time for questions. So we have these estimates that come from our time series analysis, and it's sort of strongly suggestive that the nature of substitution between the uses of oil and gas have been affected by the US's period of initially being an importer, and then sort of the fracking boom, and then the expansion of LNG exports. And the sort of coefficients that we're getting appear to be kind of rational and consistent with the underlying engineering estimates of what you might expect to see in a world where steam fire generation is competing with NGCC fire generation. Additional sort of points to note are to look at how LNG contracting behavior has changed as a result of this new source of supply from North America coming into the mix. And in particular, what we see is that there's increasing use of Henry Hub as a fraction of contracting relative to, say, Japan crude cocktail, right, or Brent. We also have kind of recently long-term contracts being structured for production in North America relative to the price of consumption in Europe, right? So clearly that implies an expectation of a co-integrating relationship going forward. Similarly, Cheniere has a long-term purchase agreement. And then sort of Venture Global's contract renegotiation, essentially that is their failure to fill long-term contracts while selling to Europe in the spot market, reflecting the fact that their counterparties are probably looking for better terms of trade relative to the spread between TTF and Henry Hub. Turning a little bit to life cycle analysis, obviously, again, we're looking at one wedge, right? The CO2 impacts on the US electricity sector. But to understand sort of the implications fully, we'd want to account for the impacts on methane, both in terms of extraction and leaks during the value chain. We want to understand what the costs from a CO2 standpoint are of compression and liquefaction of CO2, transport of CO2, possibly regasification. And then also just from a sort of what are the CO2 consequences of changes in end use? Though, you know, one might argue maybe that's not something that needs to be accounted for in life cycle analysis if it's going to be captured downstream. And with that, let me turn it over to the audience for any questions. Thanks very much. Thanks for hanging in there with me.
Thank you for a wonderful, very informative, very visually pleasing presentation. I think that maybe the chat is disabled. Bear with us, everyone. We're trying this out new, but people should be able to drop questions in the Q&A, and then I'm not sure, maybe Lauren, if you're able to let people speak for themselves. If not, I can just read things out, that's fine. While people are putting things into the Q&A, I will take advantage of my moderator privileges and ask a question. I I think that the analysis is very convincing that LNG has caused this shift, this co-integration. But one question I had is whether or not you considered other potential explanations for a price shift. So something that I was wondering about reading the papers, that there's been a ton of consolidation in the US oil and gas market. And so wondering if those producers are now able to increase prices. So just curious whether or not there are things in your analysis that sort of take that off the table, or if that could be in the noise. That'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, let me just chime in if I could, Jim Stock. So Matt, thanks for that presentation. That was really good. The that's that may or may not be true, so that's a possibility. The thing is, if that were the case, what you would expect is maybe there'd be a creeping up, or there'd be an upward shift, or something like that, if there's more market pressure. But there's no reason at all why that would have any reconnection with international prices. So the only way you get this reconnection with international prices, which is so strikingly there right in Figure 1 and in the co-integration, is if they're actually able to trade on international markets. And so it's that reconnection that really is the main thing that's there. So could that have been partly? The thing is, actually, once you have that reconnection and it's just this international commodity, the question is are there more rents to those producers, or who's getting those rents? There's big rents somewhere, right? Because if you're producing at really the low marginal cost that's going into Henry Hub, but now you're getting to sell on international markets, those profits they're accruing potentially maybe to the upstream gas producer, probably more likely to the LNG. But actually, a lot of these LNG facilities are just selling at transaction cost. They're not there to really take speculative positions. They're there to just, have a solid revenue flow on the liquefaction and the putting it on the tanker. And a lot of the speculation is then once it's on the tanker, those contracts can be resold. So there's a lot of market activity between when the gas is actually put on the tanker, the LNG tanker, and when it's delivered. So there are people who are taking speculative positions and are making a lot of money on this. There's some extent to which those are probably the LNG producers, because the LNG producers used to be in the original setting, like the original Cheniere Train 1, it was entirely financed by long-term offtake agreements. Now they're reaching FID with, maybe 60% or 70% long-term offtake, and the rest of it's going to be sold in shorter-term markets. So we're seeing that evolve. Exactly who's making all of this extra money it's going to be a combination. But there's, big money being made by these players because of this large wedge between the marginal cost, even with liquefaction, and what you get to sell it at internationally. And it's exactly those pressures that are driving these things together.
Thanks. That's a really helpful overview of what's at play here. That's great. I have a Q&A question from Professor Douglas Almond, and it looks like we can unmute you. Yep.
Thank you.
There you are.
Terrific presentation and talk. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about, when discussing the greenhouse gas emissions impacts for the United States, about the leakage rate from the natural gas supply chain. And I saw that you cited Howarth, who I think estimates really high leakage rates, and not thinking about it very deeply. If, production is going up over time, I would think that leaks are going up over time, and methane being such a potent greenhouse gas, could that be a first order effect?
Yeah, I mean, I think it potentially could. Certainly in the short run, I think we have some research that shows the sort of leakiness of the system is declining over time, right? And there are other policies that are in place that are designed to try and incentivize reduction in leak rates. But you're right, with the global warming potential of methane, that's between 20 and 30 times higher in sort of the medium run as CO2. Like very quickly, the CO2 benefits that come from substitution to lower emitting source of generation could be overwhelmed. And I think that's just something that, requires more analysis.
Let me underscore what Mantra said about it requiring more analysis. I think this is a fascinating topic, and we've done some reading on this. I don't want to pretend that we've done any original research, but I think it's really interesting. As you pointed out, Doug, and thanks, Doug, for attending. The Haworth paper it has sort of very high leakage rates, but a lot of that is basically using historical estimates or based on historical estimates. And this industry is changing extremely quickly for a number of reasons, much of which we owe partial credit to EDF on. I mean, EDF has had a giant enterprise, including launching a rocket in terms of reducing upstream ONG emissions, and has been very helpful in terms of pushing through the methane fee that's in the IRA. And then also we have this very recent round of methane regs from the EPA under the Clean Air Act. So there's a number of reasons to think that some of the worst methane emissions from the far upstream are going to be reduced. How much they're going to be reduced, I'm not sure, we'll have to see, but these are very ambitious policies. They're going to be reducing those emissions. At the compression stage, there's a lot of energy that's used in the liquefaction facility and in compression. And something that we've learned, again, fairly recently, and this is fascinating, that a number of these facilities now are being built using renewables. So they're building actually dedicated renewables, or they're contracting for renewables to provide their electricity. Why would they be bothering to do that? Because, this is the third part, there's downstream demand for it. So if you're selling into Europe, Europe likes to have certified clean gas. And so there's a number of ways you can do that, but one of them is to cleaning up this entire supply chain. So there's a market premium for for using renewables. And actually, it's cheaper to use the renewables than to burn that gas anyway for a lot of the electricity. So there's really big changes in here. I don't, you'd have to do the measurement, but looking at what's happened historically could be very different than what's happening prospectively. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing the analysis that comes out of that.
Thank you very much.
So we are unfortunately at time. I encourage anyone who had a question and didn't get a chance to raise it to reach out to either Lauren or myself, and we can connect you with Jim and Matt for follow-up. And I would love to talk more about the international implications and the lock-in effects that you all mentioned. Those are things that I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on. But for now, I just want to thank you both again for making the time to come and speak with us. I know I learned a lot reading this paper and hearing your perspectives on it. And then I just encourage everyone to check out our seminar webpage. I dropped it in the chat to stay in touch for future seminars. Thanks, everyone, and I hope everyone has a nice rest of their day.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for coming, Matt and Jim. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. This is great. I appreciate
This was
that.
fun.
Are you guys gonna sort of continue this research agenda at all?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, it's interesting, really. It's interesting intellectually, and obviously it's quite important. So, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because I couldn't help but think about, what it means for international emissions. And
Yeah.
it seems like such an obvious next.
Yeah, I have a student. The international emissions
Yeah.
problem is really quite complicated. I have a student, Constanza Abuin, who started a year ago or something, started a project on exactly this and on the international side. And she, I'm sure hoping that she has results soon, because I would love to see those. I mean, she has results, but results she wants to share. Because I'd really love to see those enter into the revision process and the DOE update, because this is a really hard problem to model. And I don't think there's really any good models out there. You can do back of the envelopes, and that might get you into a ballpark, but actually you're not going to get any of these lock-in effects in back of the envelopes. That's such an important piece of it, right? So you can imagine short-term impacts internationally being more gas, less coal, but the problem then is that's locking in those gas commitments, and then what does that mean for renewables 5 years and 10 years from now? And that's like that's a really big question to figure out.
And I mean, you can see the dynamics in our data, our simulations just within the US, right? So you could imagine possibly the reverse going on in Europe and Japan and China.
Yeah.
So it's a question of what is the scale?
Yeah. And you've got to quantify all of this.
I'd love to learn more about the international work. We've been working a little bit with Ruud Egging-Bratseth at the Norwegian School of Economics, and he's developed it's a global gas model that's specifically looking at trade flows, and we've been looking at it in the context of methane to understand, like, oh, if you have a buyers club in Japan, how does that impact methane emissions? But I mean, mostly what it's doing is showing how it impacts trade. And I think that would be really interesting to kind of connect those two pieces.
Okay, so I just dropped Constanza's email into chat. Why don't you email Constanza? She'd be delighted to talk about it. CC me so that I know that the two of you have connected. And I bet she doesn't. I bet I didn't know about who is this in the Norwegian? What's his name?
Ruud Egging-Bratseth. Here, I'll drop his.
Okay, so I haven't heard about that, and I'm sure she'd be very eager to hear about what he's up to.
Yeah. Oh, it's not economics, it's science and technology. I thought that was wrong as I said it out loud. Yeah, I'd be happy. I'll reach out to her, and would be thrilled to make that connection.
Cool. Okay, that's great.
Yeah, well, thanks again for coming. We appreciate it.
Totally.
Thanks. Okay, and keep us informed as to what you folks are up to too, because I know you're actively engaged in this. And or I don't know how actively engaged you are. I know that NRDC is actively engaged, and we've spoken with NRDC on this topic also.
Yeah, my sense is, maybe there's stuff going on I don't know about that's possible at EDF, but I feel like we're still wrapping our heads around LNG. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Good. Okay,
Yeah,
thank
I
you.
think so too. And I'll like poke around about this CEC thing and let you know
Oh yeah,
if
please do.
anything comes up. So
Yeah, it would be great. If you don't mind putting me in touch with the California director.
yeah, sure.
There are a lot of things we could chat about.
Okay. Yeah, take it easy, guys.
All right,
Thanks.
you too. Bye.
Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.